Sometime back in the second half of the 1970s, my parents and I were saying goodbye to my grandparents on the sidewalk next to the car, and I couldn't have been no more than 1 or 2 years old. My grandparents lived in the Little Havana area of Miami, and each weekend we drive out from Sweetwater to visit them. And I remember it being just after dusk, looking up at my family members, and my grandfather was there. Then my father said to me, "You're American." And I looked attentively. Then he said, "I'm Cuban." And I was listening. And then he said, "And grandfather is a Spaniard." And at that moment, I burst into tears crying. I remember feeling as if he were distancing me, that much more removed from my grandfather. And I wrapped my arms around his leg. And then my father said, "Okay, that's enough. We're going home." A lot is said over Cubans, the history, politics, and a whole lot of other things. In this series, we'll explore family history, revisit DNA results, and maybe do some analysis over various related topics. If you're curious, feel free to follow along. I was born at Mercy Hospital, and my father had the foresight to film back then, and these reels have been a great comfort to me all these years after. Since the 70s, we lived in Sweetwater out on the western edge of Dade County. Our home was on the corner in front of the Tamiami Canal, which was lined with pine trees. One of my earliest memories was my father sitting in the living room chair and calling to me, encouraging me to crawl over, which I did, and he sang praises to me. I remember that very well. I also remember the first time I became more aware of my surroundings, or at least the moment that stuck with me. I was sitting in the high chair in my room, and in not so many words, I just from one moment to the next, I became aware of other things. I just think of it as a moment of more awareness. It's just something I remember. As I got older, I'd go out and play with the neighborhood friends, listening to heavy metal cassettes like Ozzy Osbourne and AC/DC and such. We'd walk to the corner store on 109th and we'd buy candy or baseball cards with the chewing gum in them. Sometimes I'd be invited to the Hialeah Speedway, and it was a lot of fun. One time we had special tickets and we got to ride in the back of the race cars. So that was a blast. At some point, my dad installed a pool at home, and it was incredible. All the neighborhood kids would go and swim. There's a lot to say about growing up in the 80s here in South Florida, Miami, Sweetwater, and maybe we'll look at that more in upcoming videos. I started this episode telling the story where my dad said, "You're American, I'm Cuban, and grandfather's a Spaniard." The history of each family is unique, and likewise, there's similarities from place to place as well as differences. Doing genealogy and reading due to the curiosity that leads me down different rabbit holes, I've discovered many interesting things that span various topics. Some people, descendants of Cuban exiles, may say they're Cuban, may say they're American. Some may say Cuban American. I think it's all fine according to how people feel and think. To me, I'm from the country where I was born in, such as my father explained to me so long ago. And logistically, that's the truth of the matter. But it's not the only way people may or may not see it. Although culture and nationality are two separate categories, and likewise with ethnicity, there's overlap. But we've had a very complex history unfold here in Miami, which started in Cuba, and before that in Spain and other places. And the history of the island goes back a very long time. There are families that go back to the earliest of settlers, and others, like our ancestors, arrived in the latter half of the 1800s, towards the turn of the century. And those events have their own involved histories within the greater Cuban story. I'd like to read you a story about my family from the newspaper back in September of 1987. To set this up, back in 87, the Pope was going to visit the Tamiami Trail and perform a mass. Always concerned and active in helping end the dictatorship on the island, my dad planned to manufacture a huge Cuban flag to bring awareness to human rights violations in Cuba. And he did just that. Here's the article. Cuban flag has solemn message. Banner in mourning will greet the Pope by Candy Hatcher, Palm Beach Post staff writer. Miami, a silent, solemn message for Pope John Paul II waits for him across the street from Tamiami Park. If the Pope sees the giant Cuban flag with a black bow when he goes to the park Friday morning to celebrate Mass, he will understand, the flag owners say. When a country is draped in black, it's in mourning. Something has gone wrong, said Eloy Escajedo, a native of Cuba. Quote, pray for my country, unquote. He asks as he hoists the 12-foot long flag up the huge flagpole in front of his house. His won't be the only Cuban flag flying in the heavily Hispanic neighborhood that surrounds the park, but it may well be the largest. Family project. Escajedo cut the fabric for the flag. His 70-year-old mother, Nena, stitched together the pieces. For 3 days, she sat at her old Singer sewing machine in a tiny shed behind the house. It lacked air conditioning, but she ignored the sweat running down her face. She endured the throbbing pain in her arthritic hands. The effort was necessary, the small, frail woman said. Fidel Castro, quote, malo, unquote. Her son said the Pope must talk about the political turmoil in Cuba during his 9-day tour of the United States. Quote, he's my Pope, but he no talk about human rights and Cuba. I gonna be upset, Escajedo said. Like most Cubans in Miami, Escajedo feels a public sentiment from the Pope about the conditions in Cuba could compel Castro to relax some of his strict controls over the island and release some of the 15,000 political prisoners there. Quarter century here, Escajedo, 42, came to America 25 years ago, and his parents joined him 5 years later. The older Escajedos speak only Spanish and live a quiet religious life. A plate with John Paul II's picture hangs on a wall in their small house. Escajedo works in a boatyard security office at night and some days to support his wife and son, Eloy III. The boy is an American citizen, Escajedo said proudly. Quote, we love this country. We feel it our country, unquote. Well, that's a little introduction. We'll leave it there for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.